Welcome to the Book Blast podcast, our international podcast series, Bridging the Divide, Translation and the Art of Empathy, showcases a selection of the best writing in translation from around the world being published this year in the UK by 10 leading independent houses and a special guest. This interview is being recorded via Zoom during the COVID-19 lockdown. I'll now hand over to my podcast co-host, Lucy Popescu.
I'm delighted to be able to interview Tommy Wieringa and his English translator Sam Garrett. There is a chilling beauty to many bleak landscapes, and Tommy Wieringa's stark portrait of a remote Dutch community, expertly translated by Sam Garrett, reminds us that the same is true in literature. The Blessed Rita is a compelling portrait of the forgotten, and Wieringa makes a convincing case for empathy with those living on the margins of society. Just to set the scene, Paul and Hedwig live in rural East Netherlands, close to the German border. The middle-aged friends enjoy an awkward bachelor existence and go on holiday together once a year, usually to Asian countries with an accessible sex trade. Back home, Paul visits Club Pasha to see his favourite prostitute Rita. Tommy, what drew you to the subject and themes of the Blessed Rita?
My father, Lucy. Hello. Thanks for having me, by the way. No, it was my father. It was quite. It's actually quite a simple autobiographical idea that brought me to this book, because I was reminded of the period in my life when my mother left my father and left me and my father behind in a big old farmhouse, and suddenly my father had responsibility over me, and he had to take care of me, and he had no idea how to do that. And he learned himself, and that was actually the start of the book. He learned himself then 5 basic meals, to cook 5 basic meals. They were all with potatoes.
Yes.
And so I found it when I was in my 40s already. I thought I suddenly the memory struck me as being quite moving. This poor man being left by his wife and left with his 11-year-old son. It was actually the first time that we really met. So I thought that there's a book in that, because it was in this remote area of Twente, which is in the east of the Netherlands. 2 men left behind in a left behind area of the country. So that's what brought me to it.
Paul and Hedwig aren't hugely sympathetic characters, so how did you ensure we would empathise with them?
I never thought of that, actually. Maybe I thought they made good characters, and if they are sympathetic, it's by accident.
Tommy, you seem to make a habit of writing about marginalised characters. In Little Caesar, Ludwig is restless, yearning for stability, full of irrational decisions and erotic obsessions. In your last book, The Death of Murat Idrissi, 19-year-old Murat is just one of many Moroccans who lives in the slums and dreams of working in Europe. What draws you to write about men on the margins?
I was in Morocco once, and there I found I've been away from the world quite a while, but since the crisis broke out, maybe you can help me. Who's the writer again who lived in, the American writer? Paul Bowles. Yes, Paul Bowles. Thank you. And he wrote that luxury actually blurs your vision. And I think the same way. I don't find my material in cities nor in luxury. For me, stories lie in poorer circumstances. That's where I find my material.
Their world is devoid of meaningful relationships with women. Was this deliberate?
If it's there, then it's deliberate. But I'm so sorry to say that. But no, it is of course deliberate. And for the Blessed Rita, I started off with my own biography, and then I sort of went on with men whom I still know who live in that area. Men I went to school with. We went to a Catholic boys' school at the time. Many of them still live with their parents, and they, in the end, they buried their parents. They never left home. They never had meaningful relationships with women. That's why, for instance, Paul travels to Asia, as you said in the introduction, to have his fair share of the deal. So that's where he finds his erotic life. It is indeed a bit sad, but quite common.
Did you grow up in a rural community?
Yes, it's my background, yeah.
Rita is the patron saint of lost causes. Faith seems to have fallen apart in this Catholic community. The church limps on, and a Brazilian priest serves 3 parishes. As Paul observes, missionary work was coming back in style, but now it was the poor Europeans who needed help. Is there really no hope for characters like Paul and Hedwig? Are you suggesting that this lack of confidence in themselves is partly down to the erosion of faith?
Partly, but this is something I noticed I write a lot in monasteries. What you see there is that that actually the faith is fading away, and now there's a sort of a turning around, because now when we Christianized, for instance, Brazilians or Argentinians, now they come back to Europe and to make up for they live in many of them live in our monasteries now, because otherwise they would be empty. And in the Blessed Rita, there is indeed a man of God who is actually from Brazil. So that you can see actually what I try to do is to show what happens to a remote area in these times of globalization.
Yeah.
Because it influences. For instance, the Chinese are coming to take over the restaurant in the village. There's a Brazilian man of God, or how do you call that?
Vicar.
A priest. Yeah. So there's a Brazilian priest. So globalization has its effect on even on remote areas like Twente.
Many villagers have moved west. The Chinese and East Europeans have filled the vacuum, treated with barely concealed contempt by the remaining locals. Is this forgotten backwater a comment on the inequality of the European Union?
It is a comment, maybe not so much of the European Union, but also that the sense of being left behind is quite strong in this area. It partly has to do with the European Union, but also with national government. All the focus is on the not on the rural area, but on the Utrecht, Rotterdam, Amsterdam. So this urbanized area, that's where the main focus is on. All the police is in this urbanized area and not in Twente anymore. So the police leaves these areas, and nowadays drug lords actually take over. So they are the ones who are in charge in these areas. Quite sad. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I have one more little anecdote to tell. There was it is on the German border, and I was walking there because I did quite a lot of research, because I know this area from my childhood, but coming back there is important, I thought. So I went back, and I asked a man who lived right on the border. I asked him where this big border post was. This was a big stone slab which had been there since the 15th century. And I asked him where it was. He said, if I tell, because it was gone suddenly. And I asked this farmer, I said, where is it? Has it been stolen? He said, yes. And I asked, you know who did it? He said, yes. And I asked, can you tell me who did it, where the stone is? And he said, no, because if I tell you, tomorrow my house will be burnt down. Then I asked, And what about the police? And then he gave me this little smile and said, sorry, we don't have police in this area. So that's how people feel.
Tommy, regarding empathy for your characters and their situations, I've previously described your approach as brutal but effective. Even the sparseness of your prose, reflected in Sam's masterly translations, magnifies the harsh reality of many of your characters and the need for our compassion. By writing about flawed characters, you remind us of our shared humanity. Was that always your intention?
It's not so much as a humanist political agenda that I follow. It's just that I look at these people, I find them, and I wrote about it in my diary because I started a diary in 2015 because I didn't know where to go with this book. Then I remembered all these characters I knew from my childhood, and it's very easy to make fun of them, for they have very few achievements. They still live with their parents. You might call them sad, but the moment you know them, the moment there's a real that you're in real contact with them, all these ideas fade away. So I'm interested in how people live and how to live. So maybe that's an answer to your question. That I don't want to make fun of them, because they in their own right, they are very strong and highly moral characters. And the problem is that I gave them another life in prose, which they didn't ask for. It's always the problem. How much can you take of someone's life? And as a novelist, you're of course a very chic thief. So I thought, well, when I'm a thief, I don't want to rob them, although I'm a thief.
Yes.
I want to give them make them a little better than they are, even.
Yes, a little bit heroic.
Yes.
There is a little bit heroic in both of them, yeah.
Yes. That's what I give back to them.
Sam, how did you become a translator?
Oh, goodness. Lucy, I became a translator. Actually, I studied journalism at school in the United States and came to Holland. Actually, one of the interesting things about the educational system in the United States is that you can become a journalist, you can become lots of things and never learn another language other than English. I started off as a journalist, and I have always been a great lover of good stories. I think that I became a translator really because life moved me then finally to the Netherlands in the early 1980s, after I met my partner, and we're still together after 40 years. I moved to the Netherlands, and I had very little to do the first 2 or 3 years because I wasn't allowed to work. I wasn't really even allowed to be in the country. So what was I to do? I noticed, fascinated by this country, by this language, by this culture. And I think just out of lack of any really constructive thing to do besides a few odd jobs that I have, I really immersed myself in Dutch and realized once I started reading a bit in Dutch and reading short stories and novels and things, that there were things going on in Dutch literature that I really wanted my friends in the United States to be able to read. I thought, God, they would love this. And I think that's where my desire to become a literary translator was born, was with a desire to share things that somehow pleased me or challenged me or horrified me or whatever with my good friends who didn't have the advantage of being able to speak and read this minority language.
Sam, how does translation unite people and increase empathy?
Yeah, well, I guess there are a couple of things. I think that translation literary translation and good translation is basically an empathic move. I think that someone said once that although we translators think that we're making decisions all the time, that there are really only two decisions that we make. One is either to leave the writer sort of in peace and to draw the reader closer to the writer. That's choice one you can make. Or to say, I'm going to leave the reader in peace and I'm going to draw what the writer has done closer to the reader for their understanding. That dichotomy, when you're making a decision like, do I need to make this understandable for an audience, or do I have to challenge my audience in the same way that this writer maybe has challenged me in their own language? That choice and that consideration is always involves empathy. You're always either saying, I'm being true to this writer, I am trying to understand what they do and I'm trying to do what they did then on paper. Or you say, I have these readers and I feel for these readers and I want them very badly to understand what's going on here. So you're always being sort of swung back and forth between the two, but you're always involved in putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
I think you've translated all of Tommy's books into English.
No, unfortunately, I haven't. I think Tommy's first three novels I haven't translated. I started with Joe Speedboat, which sort of came at me as it did at an awful lot of people, as a sort of a freight train kind of roaring onto the landscape of Dutch literature. And somehow I was fortunate enough to be asked to do that book. So that was my first one. That was my baptism as far as translating Tommy goes. But since then, I've translated, I think, 4 or 5 of Tommy's novels, almost everything that's come out since, yeah.
What makes him such a special writer in your view? And in what way is his writing universal?
Let's see. What makes Tommy a special writer, I think, is really that he is such a craftsman. I've heard Tommy say a number of times, I remember quoting this thing which someone, I don't know whether it was Isaac Babel himself or whether it was an admirer of Babel's Eisenstein talking about Isaac Babel's prose, who said something like, no iron can enter the human heart with such effect as a period placed at just the right moment.
Yes.
Now, that's the thing. That's what makes Tommy in that way a special writer too. He realized that, I think, down to the soles of his writer's feet, and goes for that. And that is a unique thing. And that also, that's part of why I've loved translating Tommy's work, is because then I am faced with a challenge of trying to get that period at just the right spot and to have that kind of impact on the reader's part. That's unusual. I think also that, and you said, what makes Tommy universal? What makes his writing universal?
Yeah.
I think it's universal because it's so specific in so many ways. It's very grounded. It's grounded in life often. The characters who come sort of parading along in the books are people we believe in because they seem very real and often like people we've known or like people that maybe we've wanted to be or have absolutely not wanted to be at some point. And I think that when writing is universal, it's because it's grounded so firmly in life. It can be very specifically a story about the Eastern Netherlands, Twente. It can be a story about boredom during the Christmas holidays in Amsterdam right after the Second World War. But if it's grounded, if it's recognizable, if it's real, then it becomes universal, no matter how specific and how local the setting.
Sam, what were some of the challenges you faced when translating this text? I'm thinking in particular if there were any issues with the character's vernacular, or if it was fairly straightforward.
Well, Well, no, I don't know that it was fairly straightforward. It was not. The Blessed Rita, even in Dutch, is not like a regional novel. So it wasn't, the challenge wasn't trying to find some sort of imaginary idiom that would reflect the way these people spoke. And thankfully, that's really hard to do, and often doesn't work, I think, especially in translation. It wasn't that. What the challenge was, really, I think, is that what Tommy's done a very good job of is reflecting this sort of taciturn nature of conversation. I think especially in the rural Netherlands. I mean, Twente is a case in point, but Groningen, up in the north of the country, is also this famous. The people from the west of Holland laugh about it. It's, why use 5 words if 3 will do, and why use 3 words if you can get away with 1? That was a challenge to do sometimes, because it seems to me that in English we, generally speaking, tend to be a bit more expansive than that. So one word answers to things, I think, like that are hard to translate. That was a challenge at times. Yeah.
What, in your view, makes a good translator?
I think that a good translator probably, this theme that you were talking about, this empathy. I think a good translator, I think there are a couple of things. I think you have to have the toolkit. I think you have to have sort of the writerly toolkit. So you know how to do things. You know how to build a sentence in a certain way to create a certain effect, in the same way that a writer knows how to do that. And you have the ability to think about that and to make decisions as far as that goes. So there's that technical side of it, which you really have to have. Of course, the knowledge of the language and the culture, a very deep knowledge of both language and culture, that's necessary for a good translator. I'm completely convinced of that. And then also the empathy that you're talking about, somehow the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, whether it's the writer, whether it's the character that you're dealing with at that moment, whether it's the reader that you're imagining and saying, are they going to understand what's going on? I think those two things. I think there's a very hardware side and an empathetic, very soft side to being a good translator.
Does it matter if the reader hears the original language in the translation, or do you aim for a seamless translation?
Seamlessness isn't something that I aim for in and of itself. That's for sure. I guess if that happens, it's sort of a byproduct of saying, hey, I want the reader to have as clear an understanding, to the reader to be bothered as little by my presence as possible. That can lead to seamlessness, but I think it's not an objective that I have. I guess when you say, can the reader be able to hear the original, or Dutch in this case, in it? I think that I think not at the level of the words and syntax and that sort of thing. It shouldn't be the case, but I think that you're trying to convey. Often with good writing, you're trying to convey also a certain music or a certain rhythm or even a certain aesthetic, and you're trying to do that. And that can be very particular. Those things can be very particular to a certain culture or a certain language. And also, I think, like an example, the Death of Murat Idrissi, even though there's like sort of this gruesome, I'm not going to blow the ending of the book. I'm not going to do a spoiler here, but even though there's this kind of gruesome secret being born along here, the end of the book and often through the book is very lyrical. These descriptions of the Spanish landscape and kind of the edginess in Morocco. That's all done with this almost kind of a painterly sort of feeling. And the very end of the book, this very bleak, I think that was the word that you used earlier, this very bleak scene at the end of the book is also, in some funny way, is very beautiful. also.
Yeah.
It's like a composition. It's a painterly composition. So you can do all that, and maybe the reader's not expecting that. Maybe that's not part of their tradition to deal with a subject in that way. But then as a translator, I hope I can give them that and give them a bit of a feeling for, hey, things can be different. You can write differently about things.
What are you both working on next?
Sam,
Tommy.
your turn.
My turn?
Yes.
I'm translating a book by a Dutch writer by the name of Manon Uphoff.
Uh-huh.
And she's written a novel called Falling is Like Flying. That's going to be coming out in Pushkin in the fall of 2020, inshallah. And then after that, I'm going to do a nonfiction book. I'm doing a book by Frank Westerman about what it means to be human. So those are my two projects, sort of in the medium term.
And I am working, of course, as I always do, working on a novel, but this one is going to be, 600 pages or so. So still some work ahead.
Goodness.
So I'm really sorry to bother Sam with that in a year or two.
100 pages. Oh, okay, all right. We'll brace ourselves for that. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Could we finish with a short reading in Dutch and then English?
Fantastic. Sam, shall we do it from the 5th chapter?
Okay, let's see. The beginning of the 5th chapter?
Let's see. After the first, meer dan 30 jaar geleden, it's called in Dutch. After.
I'm going to have to hold on.
It was more than 30 years ago that he had gone into that field.
I've got it.
Meer dan 30 jaar geleden was het dat hij hier met zijn metaaldetector het veld in was gegaan. 16, 17 was hij toen. En hij had daarna nooit meer iets gevonden wat belangrijker was dan de laars, het kompas en het vliegtuigwiel. Uit de hemel daalde nu een kraai neer. Een grote gezonde kraai met een grote gezonde honger. Hij landde op het open veld vlakbij een verweesde jonge haas, waarvan de moeder in de storm van de machines verloren was geraakt. De kraai zette een paar schommelpasjes, stond stil en schikte zijn veren. Met een schuin oog monsterde hij zijn prooi. Het hazenjong rende een eindje bij hem vandaan en drukte zich plat tegen de grond. Eerder op de dag lag het gras nog in regels te drogen. Hij had zich erachter kunnen verstoppen of erin weg kunnen kruipen. Maar nu was de aarde naakt en kaal. De kraai hupte achter hem aan. Hij had geen haast. De haas was klein en de akker was onafzienbaar groot. Ach, ging het altijd maar zo gemakkelijk. Het diertje deed een dappere uitval. Vlak voor het tegen de kraai opbotste, sloeg het een haak, de eeuwige list van de haas. De kraai fladderde achterwaarts op en roeide meteen weer met een paar vleugelslagen naar hem terug. Hij was geen erg goede jager, maar de tijd was in zijn voordeel. Paul Kruse bekeek de ongelijke strijd vanuit de verte. Hij onderdrukte de neiging om met wapperende armen het veld in te rennen. Hij had gedachten over jagen en gejaagd worden. In de schaduw van de bomen hield hij zich onzichtbaar en bemoeide zich nergens mee. Alles moest zijn loop hebben. In het leven van de dieren, in dat van hemzelf. Paul Kruse, meer haas dan kraai. Solitair levend prooidier. Hazenhart. Ver weg, aan de overzijde van de hoge, bollende akker, reed een auto. Toen een trekker. Je hoorde ze nog een tijdje, dan was het weer stil. Alleen het gele land en hij aan de bosrand. De smispelende beek daarachter. Het peil was ongebruikelijk laag voor deze tijd van het jaar. Stil sleepte de stroom zich door het halfdonker onder de bomen. De bodem was rood van oer. De haas, zo groot als de hand van een meisje, begon op te geven. Hij drukte zich sidderend tegen de grond. Het was tijd, en de tijd bediende zich van een zwart gerokt snaveldier. Het pikte naar je. Je voelde alles. Elke sabelhouw, dacht Paul, maar je moest je harden. Het vroeg een sterk harnas om neutraal te zijn. Met zijn dolksnavel hakte de vogel op hem in. Paul knipperde niet met zijn ogen. Je moest je plaats in de voedselketen kennen, dacht hij. Je plaats in de voedselketen en jezelf wapenen.
Nice. It was more than 30 years ago that he had gone into that field with his metal detector. 16 or 17 he was at the time. And after that, he'd never found anything as important as the boot, the compass, and the airplane wheel. Down from the sky, a crow descended now, a big, healthy crow with a big, healthy appetite. It landed in the open field, close to a young orphaned hare that had lost its mother in the storm of harvesters. The crow took a few rocking steps, stood still and ruffled its feathers. Its head cocked to one side, it sized up its prey. The young hare ran a ways away from the crow and pressed itself against the ground. Earlier in the day, the grass had still been lying in rows to dry. It could have hidden there or crawled beneath a pile of hay, but now the ground was stripped bare. The crow hopped along after it. It was in no hurry. The hare was small and the field was endless. Ah, if only it was always this easy. The little animal made a courageous sortie. Just as it seemed about to crash into the crow, it did a button hook, a hare's old favorite trick. The crow flapped and hopped backwards, then reversed right away and rode its way forward again. The bird was not much of a hunter, but time was on its side. Paul Cruzen watched the unfair fight from a distance. He repressed the urge to go running into the field, waving his arms. He had thoughts of his own about hunting and being hunted. In the shade of the trees, he kept out of sight and minded his own business. Everything had to run its course. In the lives of animals, in his own life, that of Paul Cruzen, more hare than crow, solitary prey, rabbit heart. Far away, on the far side of the high rolling field, a car passed, then a tractor. You heard them for a while, then it was still. Only the yellow field and he in the shadow. The whispering brook back behind there, unusually low for the time of the year. The stream dragged itself quietly along through the semi-darkness beneath the trees. The bottom was red with ore. The hare, the size of a little girl's hand, was giving up. It pressed itself trembling against the ground. The time had come, and time took the form of a sharp-billed bird in widow's weeds. It picked at you. You felt everything, every saber cut, Paul thought, but you had to steel yourself. It took a strong suit of armor to be neutral. The bird lashed out at him with its dagger bill. Paul didn't blink. You had to know your place in the food chain, he thought. Know your place in the food chain and arm yourself.
Thank you very much for your time and for giving us an invaluable insight into the Blessed Rita.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. That was wonderful.
The Blessed Rita by Tommy Wieringa, translated by Sam Garrett, is published by Scribe and is available from online outlets such as Waterstones, Foyles, Donk Books, Hive and Amazon. To buy The Blessed Rita from your local independent bookseller, you can find your nearest store by visiting booksellers.org.uk/bookshop search. This podcast is brought to you by Book Blast. For more bookishness between episodes, visit online journal The Book Blast Diary or find us on Twitter @BookBlast. Special thanks to sound editor Rupert Such, theme tune composer Edward Campbell, Tommy Wieringa, translator Sam Garrett, and interviewer Lucy Popescu for taking the time to do the interview. And thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Book Blast podcast.